Hey, what's up, YouTube? This is Eddie with Positively Atheist. Today I'm going to be doing a video on a response to a couple comments I got on my video where I went over my deconversion experience going from a Christian minister to an atheist. And I'm going to put that video in the video description below. So I had an interesting dialogue on in the comments section, and I wanted to take a moment to use it for some information for this video. I thought it'd be kind of cool to kind of go through some, because the comment had a lot of standard responses I get from people. And I thought it'd be cool to use this as an opportunity to kind of go through it and help you guys understand where I'm coming from as an atheist if you are not familiar. So we'll dive right into the response, and I will come back at it with some of my thoughts as I go through it. So the commenter says, "Hey, Eddie, nice to meet you. Thanks." The first comment on here, we had a little back and forth, and the commenter says, "One of the things that you said in your reply is that you never said that there was no God." They say, "Well, my mistake, I guess. Your channel name would lead one to assume that not only are you making the claim that there is no God, but that you are especially doing it. Such as if you asked me if I was a golfer and I answer by saying I am positively a golfer. That would give you the sense that I not only was a golfer, but I was one in an extra way." Not sure what that means, but I think this is a common misconception. So my response is, this is a common misconception. It all depends on how you define atheist. And I accept that there are definitely different ways to use the terms. And, all I can do is tell you how I use them in the conversation. So just to clarify, there are generally two types of atheists. There are what I would call Gnostic atheists, and those are who believe, which makes them atheists, and they also claim to know that God does not exist, which is what makes them Gnostic. So the second type is somebody who is an agnostic atheist. This is how I define myself. This is a person who doesn't believe, which, like I said above, makes them an atheist, but they don't claim to know that God does not exist, right? That's what makes them agnostic. So, and I did a whole video on this on my channel. It's called "Why They Want You to Be Agnostic and Not Atheist," and I'll put a link to that video in the description below. But there is a difference between the two. So this is a common misunderstanding. There's a conflation of terms. So there are two questions that when you ask somebody, do you believe in a God, you're asking them to clarify their belief in a particular subject matter, being, do you believe in a God? And if somebody says yes, that makes them a theist, right? So they have a belief in a God. The opposite of a theist is what? It is an atheist, which means a person who does not believe or lacks belief. Now, there are subsets of this. There are people who will say, I believe no God exists. And there are people who say, I just don't believe in a God. And these are different. I'm going to do a video on this using mathematical theory this is a theory called the negation of X. In other words, saying X, if I come to you and say X is true, then you can either accept that and believe the same thing I do, or you could say I'm wrong, meaning you're saying that X is false. But there's a third position, which is you could say, I don't believe you when you say X is true. You're not calling me a liar. You're not saying the opposite is true. This is negation of X. You're saying I don't believe you, right? In either case, whether you claim X is false or you just simply lack the belief that I have, X being true, then you are still in the category of non-belief. So in other words, you have atheism, which is, there's two subsets of beliefs. There's two subsets of atheism, which is lacking belief and certainty in the opposition of the belief. So, but in either case, you're an atheist. So agnosticism deals with a claim of knowledge to whatever the belief is in question. So you could be agnostic about the Easter Bunny. You could be agnostic about fairies. You could be agnostic about anything, Agnosticism is a term that you can use for any subject matter when you're talking about what you believe. So I could ask you, for instance, we could make up a word for people who believe in Santa Claus. We can call them Santa Clausians. So if you're a person who believes in Santa Claus, we could call you a Santa Clausian. But if you're a person who doesn't believe in Santa Claus, either in the affirmative, stating there are no Santa Clauses, or B, stating I just don't believe in Santa Claus, you would be an Santa Clausian, meaning without the belief in Santa Claus. But there will still be a question as to what you know, because if you don't believe in Santa Claus, you can have the two positions. You can be like, I either have information that causes my belief, or I don't have any information. And we would choose, then you would have the decision if you were agnostic or gnostic. I'll do another video on this to kind of break it down a little bit more, but stay tuned for that one. It'll be the negation of X, where we'll discuss the differences between making a positive claim in the opposition, or just simply holding a neutral, basically essentially a neutral position when it comes to this. But both positions are still without belief. So in this case, I'm an atheist. That was kind of a long rant, but I'll go through a little bit more as we go along. The writer goes on to say, God does exist. My response is the same as it was before, which is, hey, demonstrate it. I understand you, and this is a lot of things that a lot of theists get wrong. As an atheist, I understand you believe that God exists. I get it. You believe it exists. But your belief is not tantamount to evidence to me. You still have to demonstrate that if you expect me to believe it. Now, if you don't expect me to believe it, that's fine. But don't come to me making it sound like that I should believe you if you're not willing or able to demonstrate the validity of your position. You know, if I come to you and say, if I believe that Santa Claus exists, that's fine. But if I come to you and I make it sound like that you as well should believe it, and I'm trying to make the case that's a reasonable case to make, then I do have a responsibility, at least for the sake of conversation, to try to demonstrate it. Just simply restating my belief over and over again is not making the case any further. It's just you're just continuously saying what you believe, and that's fine. Believe if you want to, but that's not convincing to me when I hear you say it. So this was the original question. I said, hey, he says the commenter says God does exist. I said, demonstrate it. So then he comes back. Then the commenter comes back and says, the entire crowd was trying to touch him because power was coming from him and healing them all. Luke 6:19. So he quotes a Bible verse. And my response is simply, look, this isn't demonstrating your claim. All you're doing is telling me a story, right? You're telling me that other people believe something, and that's fine. But you haven't demonstrated any of it's actually true. All you're doing is restating what other people have believed. He's claiming that there was an entire crowd that trying to touch him, that he supposedly healed them all. Well, this is a story. I mean, we know any of these people from Luke 6:19? Can we interview any of these people? No, they don't even name any names here. But even if they did, even if we could go into a time machine and go back in time and meet all these supposed people that this verse is talking about and interview each one of them, what will we have then? We would still have the same thing we have now, which is hearsay. We would just have some people saying they believe something is true. Okay. What if we took it a step further? What if we got a time machine and we ourselves went back in time and were in that crowd and felt like that we saw a bunch of people healed? Would that be sufficient enough still? No, it wouldn't be. Just because you see something and you think your interpretation of how it happened was accurate does not mean that it was real. How many times do we have to see people on death row who are falsely convicted and tried and sometimes executed because people swore under testimony that they saw this person commit a crime? I just saw a story, and I'm going to try to pull it up on the screen, later on, but if I don't, forgive me. There was an inmate that just literally was just executed, and like 6 months or a year later, investigators found evidence proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that the gentleman was not even at the crime scene, and that it was in fact not him who committed the crime. But yet there were people who swore they saw this happen. And this man was not only jailed for most of it for many years, but it was eventually executed for a crime that he didn't commit. So no, simply pointing to people who believe something and saying, oh, these people believe they saw something, doesn't convince me. And especially when we're talking about pointing to a scenario that supposedly happened 2,000 years ago, as if because it was written a lot longer, it was written long ago and far away, that all of a sudden now it has more validity. No, it doesn't. Even if I could go back in time and see it myself, it wouldn't be convincing. How would I know it's like some type of magic trick or some type of illusion or some type of misapprehension that I'm under? This is the problem I'm trying to point out here. When I ask a believer, hey, demonstrate your claim that God exists, which is what he literally comes out and says, God exists. Well, okay, demonstrate it. This isn't demonstration. This is just hearsay. He goes on, I keep saying he, you have to forgive me. The writer goes on to say, the commenter goes on to say, if you are saying that I should do the above activity to prove to you that God exists, not surprisingly, I'm going to have to tell you not to hold your breath waiting for that to happen. So my response to that is simply, well, this sounds like a personal problem to me. I mean, if you can't demonstrate that something is true, then you can't really blame me for not believing you. So instead of trying to put the onus on me and trying to blame me for not being able to believe, why don't you come back to me when you actually are able to demonstrate the validity of your claims? This is an unfair tactic that a lot of theists use when they interact with atheists. They come to us and expect us to prove them wrong, or us to prove, or they'll require us to have this burden of proof. All we're doing is saying, hey, I don't believe you. We're not trying to offend you when we say that. We're just legitimately just telling, hey, we don't believe you. Come to us with some evidence, show us what you're talking about, and then maybe I'll believe you. And by the way, if you show me sufficient evidence, I would believe you. There's a lot of things that I didn't believe once that I now believe just because I was presented with sufficient evidence. It happens all the time. So the commenter comes back on and says, the idea is not for me to demonstrate that God exists. It's for you to demonstrate that he exists. That's what Jeremiah 29:13 says. Okay, so he quotes another Bible verse. And first of all, let me just say, coming to an atheist, somebody who doesn't believe in your Bible, and quoting Bible verses doesn't help your case, right? Like, I have no reason to believe you just because the Bible says so, right? This is circular argumentation where I say, hey, I don't believe you because I don't believe what the Bible says. I don't have any reason to believe it. And you say, well, you should believe it because the Bible says you need to believe it, right? This is circular reasoning, and it's super easy to see through. So just continuously quoting Bible verses doesn't help the conversation, right? This is a way this demonstrating you're not actually engaged in the conversation. You're not listening to the fact that I don't believe you or the Bible already, and you just keep quoting Bible verses as if that matters. It'd be like if we're having a conversation and I just start quoting verses from Harry Potter, right? Or text from Harry Potter, and you say, hey, I think that's a fairy tale. And I just keep quoting them as if you do believe them. It's ignoring the conversation. You're actually engaged in a conversation with this. So the writer says, quotes, or he paraphrases Jeremiah 29:13. And it just says, hey, it's not up for God. He says the idea is not for me to demonstrate that God exists. It's for you to demonstrate that he exists. So in other words, he's saying, hey, the writer's saying, I can't prove to you God exists. That's up for you to work out with God. You need to work that with God and prove that God exists to yourself. And my response is simply, look, You're correct. And until such a time that God reveals himself to me in such a way that's convincing, then the only reasonable position is to continue my disbelief. You can't be mad at me for that. You can't be frustrated with me. So really, instead of coming to me and arguing with me, if this is your true position, then don't come at me even trying to convince me. Just pray. Just pray that God convinces me and stay out of the conversation. And that's my position on this. So then the writer goes on to say, well, that means you're demonstrating that God exists to yourself. My response is simply, look, convincing yourself of something that can't be demonstrated to others is generally called delusion. Let's face facts. If I'm convinced that I've got an imaginary friend and that imaginary friend is talking to me, and you're not sitting down and I start talking to my imaginary friend next to me, I pull up the chair and we're sitting down and I'm having a conversation with my friend here. Well, it's going to look pretty silly, right? Because there seems to be no independent way to verify whether or not I'm actually talking to another person. For you, it seems delusional. And the interesting thing about delusion is, to the person experiencing delusion, it also seems real to me, right? So if you're a person who believes you have an imaginary friend, to you do have an imaginary friend. But to me, on the outside looking in, it appears to be delusional, and it probably is. So this is the problem with the experiencing delusion. To the person experiencing the delusion, it feels real. So there's no way to disprove it unless you open your mind up to the idea that you need independent verification. Because if you were sitting down and I'm having a conversation with my imaginary friend, you could ask me, hey, who are you talking to? And I would say, well, it's my friend right here. And one easily, we could just like wave your hand over there and show that the person is not there. And that would be, as an example, a way to show me, hey, I don't believe that you have a person next to you. And then that would be up to me to show you that there is a person next to me. So I could do things. I'd be like, oh, look, I'll have them move a piece of paper here, for instance, or move or get up and, touch you or something like that, right? These are ways that I could actually demonstrate that this invisible person is actually a real person. The writer goes on to say, because he is rewarding your unmistakable, he's rewarding your unmistakable God seeking by clearly revealing himself to you in a way that he is. He quotes Hebrews 11:6, says that he is a rewarder of those who sincerely seek him. One of his first rewards would be for him to say, here I am, and let you know that he does exist. Yeah, that would be pretty impressive, right? But that hasn't happened. And so part of my response is just say, hey, it sounds like what you're saying to me is that God rewards those who live in ignorance. I mean, this is literally what's being presented here. And I don't mean that in an offensive way. What I mean is, I could use the exact same method that you're suggesting to arrive at literally any other conclusion, right? In other words, his position is, if you'll just believe it and you'll act as if it's true, then you'll believe it. So this is what we call circular reasoning. You're starting with a conclusion, then you are simply confirming your conclusion through returning to the conclusion. So if I start with the conclusion that God is real and God is able to speak to me and God does speak to me, then when I start with that as the premise, well, when I continue, when I quote unquote pray to God, then I'll hear the answer, obviously, and anything other is simply just a trick of like the devil or a trick of my mind. When in reality, it's reality facing me. When you're praying, when I was a Christian, I prayed all the time. I used to pray for people to get well. There were friends of mine who had limbs messed up or not, or completely gone. People who I saw who were amputees. I used to pray for those people all the time. And not, it's funny is God seemed to always be able to heal people's headaches or help them find their car keys, but he was never able to heal anybody's amputated leg. I never once saw an amputated leg grow back. Or I never once saw somebody who had a missing arm, all of a sudden the arm reappears. So to say that you just have to believe first and then it's confirmed to you, this is definitely a circular argument. It's important. And you can arrive at any conclusion. You can come with any idea you have. And if you come from that perspective, you'll always end with the original conclusion you came up with. So the writer goes on to say, let's see here. The writer goes on to say, the Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. 2 Chronicles 15:2. And my response is, once again, I don't really care what the Bible has to say, because the Bible is written by a bunch of people just like you and me, who wrote down their thoughts, just like this writer is writing me. So once again, just because somebody says something is true doesn't mean I'm just going to believe it, right? I have to have some type of independent validation for this. And furthermore, this is pretty much circular reasoning in itself. Listen what it says. The Lord is with you when you are with him. If you seek him, he will be found by you. In other words, if you start with the assumption that he's there, then you'll end with the conclusion that he's there. Of course you will. But once again, this could be used for any position, include any other philosophical or religious position that would contradict your belief. So obviously I'm speaking to a type of Christian here. Imagine if a Muslim used the same approach. If another Muslim was speaking to a non-Muslim and said, hey, if you'll start with the assumption that Allah is the one true God and Muhammad is his prophet, then that will be confirmed to you, right? But us atheist non-believers, we're saying, hey, look, if we start with the assumption that we're not sure or we don't have a position on it, how can we arrive at your position? Can you show us anything independently that can be independently verified that will help us draw that conclusion? And the reality is, no. As we've demonstrated here, it's not been done, and it seems that it can't be done. So the writer goes on to write and say, then you will call and the Lord will answer, you will cry and he will say, here I am. Isaiah 58:9, once again, another Bible verse demonstrating the problem here. So my response is simply, well, let's say I did call unto God. Let's say I heard a voice answer. How could I determine that it was really God, or that I wasn't simply hearing voices of some sort of a delusion? There doesn't seem to be any way to show a distinction other than I want it to be true, so thereby it is. And honestly, this isn't good enough for me. So the commenter goes on to say, here comes some words from a lady's near-death experience. So I guess he's going to tell us a story about somebody who had a near-death experience. She drowned in a canoeing accident. She was trapped in the water for a long period of time, and it left her body. I think obviously she was revived and came back to tell the story. So I guess the writer kind of left out the part where she had this near-death experience. And, this is my response to that. We get this a lot from people who believe in supernatural things, life after death, this kind of stuff. I want to point out, first of all, as an atheist and as an agnostic atheist, somebody who doesn't believe but does not claim to have knowledge that's false, I'm not opposed to the idea of there being an afterlife. I'm not saying there's not. I'm not saying there isn't something after this life. I mean, let's be honest here. The fact that we're having this conversation, the fact that I'm alive and having these thoughts, it's pretty magical, if I could use that word. I mean, it's a strange reality. And this is why I understand the temptation for people to want to believe in the supernatural, because it is strange. This is all very odd that everything seems to be in such order for us. And I'll get into the fine-tuning argument in another video, but I get it. So here we have a story about some lady who had a near-death experience. And, my response is simply like, you want me to believe, like, you believe that an experience of a lady where her brain was starved of oxygen and nutrients is somehow going to convince me if you can't convince me? So in other words, I'm having a conversation with you. You're a person who is in their correct mental state. You are able to use your mental faculties. I'm assuming you're having correct nutrients and oxygen levels to your brain. Yet you're not able to convince me, but for some reason you believe that this lady who her brain was literally starved of oxygen, literally starved of nutrients, apparently according to the story, and you want me to believe that somehow her experience is enough to convince me, and it's just not. It's not enough. And very simple explanations for why people have these experiences. Maybe I'll do another video on near-death experiences and my interpretation and take on them. But there have been countless studies of these experiences that have just completely disproved any validity of them. But I want to touch on one, since we're on the topic, that kind of really highlights one of the major problems with these near-death experiences. And I'm going to try to give an overarching summary of the problem. The interesting thing about the near-death experiences is that many people who have these, when they tell the stories of their experiences, they tend to line up coincidentally with the beliefs they already had. So in other words, Christians who are like evangelical Christians who are regular church attenders who practice their faith, when they have these quote unquote near-death experiences and they experience the afterlife, coincidentally, their experiences tend to line up pretty well with the beliefs that they already had. So if they believed in Jesus or St. Peter or whatever it was, when they tell the stories of these near-death experiences, they tend to be with Peter or Jesus or whoever. Now, what's interesting is that this is the same across every religion, right? So if you're a Muslim, right, and you believe Allah is the one true God and Muhammad is his only prophet, when Muslims have these near-death experiences, guess what kind of stories they tell? They tell very similar stories to what they already believed. They have encounters with Allah or with other figures. And you can go throughout history. This is true from like Athenian Greek religions. People who believed in Zeus or Thor, when stories are told about their near-death experiences, guess what their experiences were? They had similar experiences with what they believed. They tell stories about Valhalla and these other experiences, going to see like Hades and these kinds of things, and their stories coincidentally only line up with their stuff. Now, this isn't like a necessarily a deal breaker, except for the fact that all of these religious belief systems seem to be mutually exclusive and incompatible. As an example, Christianity claims that Jesus Christ is the one true way to God, to salvation through Christ, through Jesus Christ. Well, you can't really have that being true and Islam being true at the same time. So what's the explanation for why people have these conflicting beliefs but then have these experiences? Well, the truth is, we know through neuropsychology that at the time of death or near death in these cases, people's brains starved of oxygen, starved of nutrients, basically go into a shutdown process. And it's kind of like, I don't know why people have such a hard time explaining this or understanding it, because we all of us go to sleep every night. We kind of experience not that necessarily the brain shutting down, but we know what it's like to go to sleep. And if all of us have had these experiences where these random, like I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, my parents had a hard time waking me up for school. So my dad would sometimes come in and throw water on me or something like that to get me out of bed if I was really kind of being a pain in his butt and not getting up. So there was one time, I remember I had this dream where I was like, I felt like it was this epic journey where I was like going down this river and like we were going through like the woods. It was this really intensive dream leading up to this moment where like basically I fell off this waterfall and fell down into this water. It felt like the dream lasted for hours. And I woke up and my dad was splashing me with water. What was happening there? Well, my brain, the truth be told, what we've discovered a lot of times about dreams is that you're only dreaming for a few seconds. Even though it feels like a long time, your brain is creating this scenario. It's creating this narrative to explain what's happening to you. As it's part of like your mental state of how your brain processes information. And so even though the true dream only happened in the split of a second, it felt like a long time. And so to me, these near-death experiences are very easy to explain. They're just, it's very likely that these are just experiences that our brains are in a crisis state, are trying to come up with a narrative based upon our experiences, to explain what's happening. And it's not intentional. It's just a subconscious thing. And and it may or may not make sense because it's kind of like jumbled up information, right? Our brains aren't in a full functional state. And this has been shown in other experiments that I'll get into other times, but we'll break down some of the experiments. But, a lot of these near-death experiences, people claim to be floating above their bodies and seeing, like, they'll name specific instruments that they saw the doctors using, specific words they were saying. They seem to be able to recount all these very intricate details. So what scientists did is they set up experiments where they set up randomized controls where they would go into operating rooms and not none of the medical staff were aware of it. Nobody was aware of it. Well, they would put like signs with information on the signs, like numbers or stuff like that. And they would put it on top of objects, like on top of a table, or they would put it on top of the ceiling, right? They would put it, so like if you're floating above, they would put it on different spots in the room, and they would test when people came out of the surgeries and they would claim they had these near-death experiences. They would ask the people to tell them about their experiences of what they saw. And the people would have all kinds of really interesting details, like very accurate details about things that the doctor said, words, phrases, tools they use, and the way they did things, right? But none of them ever mentioned any of these signs that were obvious and in plain sight, right next to, quote, quote, the tools that were being used, right? So this was an interesting conundrum because you have people telling stories that seem to have some accuracy to it, but then like lacking some crucial piece of accuracy that scientists could use to actually validate their stories. In other words, imagine if somebody had come out not knowing about the experiment and come out and say, yeah, I saw this and that, and I saw this sign that said, hey, it had this number on, like 6, or had information like, if you can read this, remember this, or something like that. Had the people been able to recount those, that would have been strong evidence that they were truly having an out-of-body experience. But scientists had a hypothesis that these people weren't having out-of-body experiences, that they were actually hearing auditory, and they were actually in some ways sensing what was going on, and their brain was putting together a narrative that did make some sense. And if you think about that, that makes a lot more sense. It doesn't really require a lot of extra like beliefs that you have to pile on top of that to come to those conclusions, but it does make sense with the data we have. And like I said, I'll do another video on near-death experiences to get to that more, but that's my thoughts on that so far. The commenter goes on to tell more story about this, says they began taking down this exceptionally beautiful path that was brilliant. They were taking me towards this great dome structure that was not only exploding, but with beauty and color, but could ever describe or ever truly explain. And I could hardly wait. I had no intention of going back to Earth, and I had all the reasons to return. I had a great life. I had a great job. I had a great husband. My children were wonderful, and I loved them more than I could ever imagine loving something on Earth. But the love that I felt for them in comparison to God's love was absolutely flowing through me. Everything was pale in comparison. Pale means lacking of color, dull. This doesn't impress me. So I understand people have these experiences. It's being, you have a near-death experience. I don't ever want to dismiss that. I understand the importance of that, and understand how important it is to people who love them and hearing their stories. And we're all happy this person supposedly made it back. Whoever, I don't know any details about this story, but this is another, I feel like, tactic that believers tend to use. They want to use these emotional pleas to try to make it seem like, oh, it's cold if you don't appreciate this. Well, I do appreciate this story. I appreciate the fact that she was able to come back and doctors were able to help her. This is a beautiful story that somebody was able to make it back. But just because I can sympathize with the story and I can appreciate the kind things doesn't mean I have to accept the conclusion, right? This is clearly a case of just the kind of an emotional plea to make me feel sympathetic and try to help me understand, like, come on board with the conclusion. And I just don't. I don't see it there. I don't see any evidence that that's real, other than, somebody had an experience. I understand. I'm not going to invalidate their experience, but just because you have an experience doesn't mean that that is what actually happened. And yeah, so that's all I have to say on that. So the commenter goes on to say, and so we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love, whoever lives in love lives in God, and God in them. He quotes 1 John 4:16. Once again, doesn't really mean anything to me. Quoting the Bible, I don't believe in it. I don't believe it's. I don't see any reason to believe it above any other book per se. And honestly, this is. I have to say, like, excuse me, but like, I didn't give God permission to be inside of me. I mean, I'm just kind of joking, but honestly, like, love is an emotion. It is an emergent. This is 2021. Okay, we have advanced a lot in science, advanced a lot in how we understand the mind. The time that people were writing the Bible, they didn't understand any. There's very little understanding about how the mind actually works, how our thoughts work, how our consciousness works. And I admit that there's a lot of questions about consciousness, but we've also figured out a lot of stuff. And the truth is, love is an emotion, right? It's a real emotion. It's a real thing. It's an emergent process that comes from a particular neurological state present in conscious beings. The existence of a God has nothing to do with it, nor offers any additional elements needed to explain it. And that's just as simply put. This idea that love is somehow evidence of God, it's not. Love is evidence of love. Love is evidence of that feeling, right? It is evidence of itself. And we have simple biological explanations to explain how we experience it and how we explain emotions. We may not understand all the exact chemistry and how it works, but we have a pretty decent understanding. And this has been shown in experiments. People can have their brains damaged and completely forget loved ones that they love their entire lives, right? This is, in other words, you can essentially tinker around the physical attributes of a brain. You can actually change the love state for somebody. So God doesn't really add anything to the equation when it comes to talking about love, and it doesn't seem to me that it demonstrates anything about a God. The commenter goes on to say, so we are told that God is love. I have studied a lot of near-death experiences. I have read or seen countless stories, such as the one above, just with a variety of different experiences. I just watched one tonight. The guy, he experienced love. He was amazing, and that you cannot find here on earth. That's not all that uncommon to hear from people who have stories like that. Do I believe that God loves you with an astonishing love? He goes on to say. My answer is simply, yeah, I'm not any more convinced by these people's personal experiences than I am by yours. All I care about is what you can demonstrate. So this is part of the problem here. Believers come to non-believers like myself, and they want to tell us their personal beliefs and what they think about. Oh, I had this personal experience. I believe this and that. And then as a non-believer, we say, well, I don't really believe you. Do you have any evidence of it? And instead of actually providing evidence for what we're asking, the believer wants to just tell us other people's stories, whether that's things found in the Bible or other stories that they've heard other people say. And, here's the thing. As a non-believer, I understand you have these beliefs. I understand other people have these beliefs. I also understand most people believe in some type of God. I get it. But that's not evidence. Just because you believe something, just because 10 people believe something, that's not convincing to me. You know what is convincing? One single piece of evidence. That's convincing. And that would do the trick. If you could just show one actual piece of independent evidence that can be verified, that would be sufficient, right? The writer goes on to say, do I have to answer as to why you can say I did see God and he didn't convince me? I didn't say that I have an answer for that. What did Jesus call Satan? Well, besides calling him a liar and father of lies, he called him the prince of the world. Do princes have power? Think about that question. Is he evil or does he desire? And so now he's flipping around. He's trying to say, well, Satan is basically infecting my mind and basically winning the day. So my response is just like, yes. So wait, so your answer is Satan is more powerful than God. Well, once again, whose fault is that? It sounds like that's God's problem. If there is a God, if he's all powerful and he created Satan, he created all this stuff. Well, I mean, isn't that really his problem? To me, it seems like it is. Even if you make the argument that God created Satan as an independent agent to basically do what it wants, God still created Satan, knowing that in the future. And so that's whose fault is that? It's still kind of his fault. I mean, you can't tell me he didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, he's supposed to be God. He's supposed to be all knowing. That's kind of one of the whole premises of God. So all this boils down to a big nothing burger, in my opinion, where it's just obfuscating and trying to pass off the buck, but really it's kind of just trying to put the onus on me, like it's my responsibility. But you're saying right here, you're admitting, well, it's Satan. Well, if it's Satan, then if Satan's blinding me, can't God overcome that? So the commenter goes on to say, yeah, so I'm sure that some of that is the reason, but my best guess would be that you didn't use persistence with really seeking God with all your heart. And this is the point I want, one of the important points I want to get to. He goes on to say, as it says, due to anyone who wants to find him. There's a saying that says the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And ladies and gentlemen, and everyone else, this is the real rub of these interactions I have, right? And that us atheists have. This is the real rub. Because it's kind of insulting. You're assuming that I'm being dishonest when I say that I've genuinely seeked after this. I mean, assuming that the other person is lying is not a good way to have a reasonable conversation. I could simply say the same thing about you. I could just say you're lying, and we would be at an impasse. We couldn't have an actual conversation about anything. So just going into a conversation and saying, well, you must be lying, you didn't seek after God, is just really, it's not intellectually honest. You're not engaged in the conversation. You're just trying to make me look bad so that you in your mind can feel like you won the day, but really you didn't actually have a discussion. So, and I can honestly say, like, if anybody sought after God in this world, like that I know, I feel that was me. I mean, I'm not going to put myself on a pedestal, but when I was in my faith, I genuinely believed. I didn't doubt. I loved God, or what I perceived to be God. I enjoyed serving the Lord. I enjoyed doing these things. I was part of worship ministry. I was part of evangelism, but I didn't do those things because I had to. I did those things. I enjoyed them. I loved Jesus at the time, what I perceived to be Jesus. I loved him and I wanted to serve him. And, and I honestly sought after God. And it's incredibly insulting and frustrating when somebody who doesn't know you comes to you and says, well, you just must not have pursued God enough. To me, that's just a way out. So you don't have to face the actual real questions that are being presented to you. You don't have to actually deal with those questions. You can just say, oh, that person just he wasn't a true believer. There's no way he actually believed in his stuff. Otherwise he wouldn't have turned away. And that's not true. I dedicated my life to God. For the first probably 30 years of my life, I was all about serving God, serving Jesus, worshiping him, and helping grow his kingdom. Like that was my life. I missed out on a lot of fun stuff that I could have been doing. I'm a DJ now, and it's taken me like constant work to try to go back and learn like the biggest hits of the time. I enjoyed, I think to myself, where could I have been in my DJing had I not had that experience? Had I been able to like explore that passion earlier on in my life? And yeah, sometimes that's like frustrating sometimes. And, as an atheist, some of you guys and girls who go through this experience, you're going to have times where you get frustrated and bitter because you're as well going to think about all the things you missed out on that you could have experienced, that you wanted to do, but that you didn't for the sake of God. But then to have somebody come to you and say, well, you never really believed, it's rather insulting. So it's something you really don't want to say to somebody, just to assume that they're lying and that they didn't ever love God. I'll leave that there. I'll do another video on that topic another time. So the commenter comes on and says, well, your suggestion that God is not able to provide enough evidence is kind of funny. He is the creator who created the sun, the moon, the ocean, all the fish in it, heaven, and infinite number of things that I couldn't even list or couldn't begin to know about. He knows you better than you know yourself by far. He is the razor sharp intelligence. He goes on to say, it is the only consciousness that is unaware. And he goes, let's just say that him having no ability to make himself known to you is not a factor, is not how it is at all. Okay. So my response is simply, okay. I mean, I guess that means he doesn't want me to know him. Once again, my fault, because think about what you're saying. You're saying exactly what I've been saying, which is, hey, if there's a God, he would be able to convince me and show me, right, in a way that was sufficient for me. But the fact that he hasn't demonstrates that either he can't show me or he doesn't want to show me. And in either case, that's not my fault, is it? And, I would like to think that if there's a God up there and he is, good and just, or it's good and just, and it has good intentions and it values reason and integrity and honesty, that being, if I die and I face it, that being would be able to look at my life and say, well, hey, look, I get it, and I appreciate the fact that you didn't just believe for the sake of convenience, or the sake that you were afraid of the alternative, or the sake that you were too cowardly to face the truth, right? I would hope that God would have respect for me and say, wow, I appreciate the fact that you were willing to, at the risk of potentially going to hell, essentially, that you were willing to withhold your belief out of a sense of integrity and commitment to discovering the truth. To me, that makes a lot of sense if there's a God out there. So this idea that somehow this is my problem, it really isn't. I mean, if you look, you're just saying it yourself, God could show me, God could make me aware, but he hasn't yet. Now, this is, once again, the only alternative is for you to accuse me of lying, to say I'm being dishonest. I was dishonest then, I'm being dishonest now. And, if that's your position, we can't really have an intellectual conversation, because just sitting here calling me a liar doesn't actually help us actually have a conversation about about the real truth of this. So the commenter goes on to say, the bottom line, God loves you. He wants to reveal himself to you. Jeremiah 29:13 does apply to you. You just don't know it. You will seek me and find me and search me with all your heart. And this is, to me, an incredibly ridiculous position to have. And here's what I mean. I want you to imagine, you were born into a family, and your whole life you were told that your dad was in one of the rooms in your house, right? But he never came out. He never interacted with you. He never did anything, right? You never actually met him. And you're 18, 19, 30 years old. And your whole life you've been told that your dad is in that room, and everybody around you tells you your dad loves you. He wants to tell you how much he loves you. He wants to tell you how much he cares for you, right? He wants to tell you how much you mean to him. But your whole life, he never came out of that room to talk to you, right? You never met him. You never experienced him. As far as you know, there is no person in that room, right? But everybody wants to tell you, oh, your dad wrote this letter for you. He wants to tell you how much he loves you. And your whole life you're thinking, if he really loves me, then why wouldn't he just come out and interact with me? Why wouldn't he come out and meet me? Like, I'm calling bullshit on that, because I'm sorry, if your dad loves you, he would at least come out and see you. And this is the truth. And this is the real rub of this whole thing. People want to come to you and say, well, God loves you and this and that. And that. But let me get this straight. The creator of the heavens and the earth, the all-powerful, all-loving God, wants me to know how much he loves and cares about me. But instead of telling me in a way that convinces me, his best approach is to tell me through some random stranger on the internet. Honestly, it sounds really pathetic. And if you think about it for yourself, it would sound pathetic in any other situation. Love is demonstrated. It's, a father who loves their kids goes out his way at least to meet them, and to get to know them and to play with them and have fun and encourage them and be there for them when they're crying physically as possible, and be in their presence and show, I have kids and I'm with them as much as I can be, and showing them my love in a real tangible way. I'm not just sending people, not sending them letters and saying, oh, I love you, one day I won't meet, maybe. No, that's not cool. So the writer, I'm wrapping things up now. The writer wraps things up by saying, why doesn't he do it greatly with the minimum effort on your part? If I was going to ask for anyone, I would be asking for myself. I have many times. And this is really telling, ladies and gentlemen, because here the writer is actually saying the same thing I'm saying. It's like, I've actually asked for God to reveal himself to me, but he hasn't. He's admitting this in his message, but yet he's trying to convince me that what I'm believing, the fact that I don't believe, is ridiculous. He should be asking himself that. Why do I believe this? Yeah, this is a problem. God doesn't seem to be revealing himself at all. I don't seem to have any evidence. And instead of being intellectually honest and just admitting that, commenters like this, people like this, suppress that down because it's too uncomfortable to think about. It's very uncomfortable to think about the idea there might not be a God. It's so uncomfortable that people would rather cover their ears and their eyes and pretend like there's nothing there, when in fact there really isn't. As far as we can tell, there isn't. That's not to say that there is no God. That's not to say that there for sure. It's just to say that we don't seem to have any way to know this information in an very independently verifiable fashion. And this is what I'm saying. I'm saying it. That's fine. But honestly, I feel like this is how many conversations like this end, where we just reach the end of the conversation. So I'll wrap up with this last comment. The user says it's a long comment because I feel like telling you that God exists and he loves you. He says, actually, when I saw your questions, my first thought was, I am tired. I don't feel like dealing with this, but I ended up doing it. Have a great day. Well, I appreciate you interacting with me and sending this comment. I always appreciate when people reach out. And same in my personal life. I appreciate when people took their time out of their days to try to convince me that God exists, because to them it's real. Because I've always had a hard time respecting people who believe, quote unquote, believe in a God, believe in hell, and believe in all that stuff, but they're not concerned for my soul enough to talk to me. To me, that presents either one of two positions. Either they really don't like me, or they don't really believe it. And in either way, I commend you for chiming in, commenting, sharing your thoughts, because that expresses to me that you have a genuine concern for me, and I appreciate that. But I'll leave you with this last thought. Do you really think that if a God actually existed and actually loved me, that any of this would be necessary at all? I mean, we don't sit around having conversations about whether or not this road out here in front of my house has a speed limit. Yeah, we may disagree on what the speed limit should be, but we're not in disagreement that there is a speed limit. And somehow our human governments, as inept and as incompetent as they can be, have figured out a way to relay such arbitrary information, such as, hey, speed limit's 35 on this road. They figured out a way to relay that information to all of us in such a way that we will never have a debate about whether or not this road has a speed limit on it. We'll never have a discussion where people are arguing, yes, this road has a speed limit. No, it doesn't. Because we figured out a way to relay that information so precisely that it doesn't happen. But yet here we're talking about one of the most important, critical points of conversation, whether or not there's a God, whether or not there's a heaven or hell, whether or not you're going there. And this is the best that we have. Arguments from personal experience, from dismissal of opinions based upon perceptions of them, and personal attacks. Not that this was super personally attacking, but the idea that I'm lying, that's sort of a personal attack. And to me, if there was a God, would we really be having these conversations? Would there be any room for these conversations? No, because he would pop in and join the conversation. And so far, the seat that I mentioned earlier where I have an invisible friend is still empty. And he could come here and join us right now if he wants to for the conversation, but he hasn't. Instead, he sent strangers and people, random people, to come to me and tell me that God loves me. And I'm sorry, that's not sufficient. So I appreciate the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, I appreciate giving it a like, and subscribe to the channel. We'll have more content coming out. I'm going to dive more into some of these topics I addressed today and break them out into specific videos. And if you have comments, you have thoughts, feel free to put them in there. I'm not going to put you on blast if you want to put something, if you want to have, but I love that fact that I could have this conversation with some real interaction from an actual commenter, and it gave me some good content for this video. So thanks again for posting that, whoever this person was. And thanks so much for watching and listening, everybody. Hope you have a great day, and keep it positively atheist out there.